Hi everyone, this is Ofer. In this video, I'm going to go over how to set up mid-server mutual authentication. In the previous video in this series, I showed you how to install a mid-server using standard installation. In that video, I was using username and password, which I will convert to mutual authentication in this video. To recap, we had three mid-servers that are hosted by a single Windows server's host. We installed mid-server 3 as the subject of our demo. You can see that mid-server 3 is not using mutual authentication currently, and instead it's using the mid-server 3 user as the standard username and password account that holds the mid-server role. Let's go to our Windows Server host and see that we have the three mid-server services currently running. I'm going to stop two of the services and just leave the server 3 running so we can focus on it for this demo. Back at the instance, we'll see that both mid servers are down and only mid server 3 is up, and I'll disable the two services later on completely. Let me open mid server 3 configuration file and show you that we are using encrypted username and password rather than mutual authentication. So here we can see that we are using the mid server 3 user, and it is using encrypted username and password. The next step is to create a certificate chain. This certificate chain typically is provided by the customer, but in this case, I don't want to pay for it, so I'm going to generate it on a separate Linux host manually. So here I'm connected to this Linux host. I've created a mid3ca Linux directory, and I'm going to open this directory using Visual Studio. The reason I like to use Visual Studio is because it gives me access to the files, to edit the files, and to make changes very easily while connected via SSH connection. I've included a detailed instruction of how to generate the certificate chain in the description of this video. The first step of creating this chain is to create a root pair. This consists of a root key and a root certificate. Here, again, I'm opening the mid3ca in a session of Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to create these directories that are included in the instructions. So you can see here in Visual Studio Code is a perfect example that you can see the directories that I've just created. The index and serial files act as a flat database to keep track of the signed certificates. Now I'm preparing the configuration file for the root certificate. The configuration file is available in the description of this video. All I've done is modified it slightly to point to the correct directory and to define the request distinguished name section that declare the information normally required for significant certificate signing request. Here I'm creating the root key. This is the command for the root key. And I'm gonna give it a password that I'll remember, which will be required later on. I'm gonna quickly change the access for the key file. And now I'm ready to create the root certificate. After the root certificate has been created, I'll just verify that the information included in the certificate is correct. The next step is to create an intermediate pair. An intermediate certificate authority is an entity that can sign certificate on behalf of the root certificate. Both the root certificate and the intermediate certificate are part of the certificate chain that we'll need to upload to the load balancer later on. The process of creating an intermediate certificate is very similar to the process that we use to create the root certificate. We're just doing it in the intermediate directory, and we're creating the folder structure and also the configuration file, similar to the one that we've created for the root certificate. Again, the configuration file for the intermediate certificate is available in the description of the video. Here, I'm creating the key for the intermediate certificate. Now, I'm using the intermediate key to create a certificate signing request, or CSR. To create an intermediate certificate, I'm signing the intermediate CSR using the root CA. As we did with the root certificate, we're checking that the details of the intermediate certificates are correct. Here, we verify the intermediate certificate against the root certificate. An OK indicates that the chain of trust is intact. We are finally ready to create the certificate chain file. When the MID server tries to verify the certificate signed by the intermediate CA, it must also verify the intermediate certificate against the root certificate. So here we're concatenating the intermediate and root certificate together. Before installing the certificate chain into the load balancer, we need to validate three things. We need to ensure that the instance is set up with the correct load balancer. We need to validate that the load balancer is set up for mutual authentication. And we need to validate that the mutual authentication plugin is enabled. So here I validated that we have the correct load balancer. And now we are validating that the load balancer is set up for mutual authentication. And now we are validating the plugin. Let's go ahead and install the certificate chain. I'm going to the CA certificate chain. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. I'm going to name it MID3 chain. Give it a short description. And now what we're going to do is attach the certificate chain that we've created. Once we submit it, the chain would be queued and then in progress. This process is going to take a long time, but when we open the certificate chain, we can see the details of the certificate chain. Once the certificate is installed on the load balancer, its status will change to exist. But until that happens, we can go ahead and create the MID server certificate that will be installed on the MID server. The first step is to create a MID server key. Now we need to convert the key from PKS1 format to PKS8, which is required by the MID server. Now I create the certificate signing request for the MID server. Now we sign the certificate request to generate the certificate. Now let's create a bundle file that will contain the PKS8 format key and the certificate, and we'll install this bundle on the MID server. Before installing the bundle on the MID server, we need to wait for the certificate chain to be installed on the load balancer. We now refresh the page and we see that the status of the chain has changed from in progress to exists. Now we can create a new user with a MID server role, and later on, we will associate the MID server certificate with this user. We create the association by navigating to the user to certificate mapping. And we'll create a new record here. We'll select the user with the MID server role that we've just created. And we will attach the MID server certificate that we've created. Let's submit a record and then go ahead and reopen it to verify that we see the correct certificate for the MID server. We have attached the certificate to the user, but now we need to install the bundle with the certificate and the key on the MID server itself. We'll take the bundle that we've created earlier. We'll copy the bundle and we'll have to install it on the MID server itself. So let's copy it, paste it into a notepad file to be installed on the MID server. We're here using a temp directory to install the bundle, to get the bundle. And then we'll issue this command to install the bundle on the MID server itself. We now need to tell the MID server to use mutual authentication rather than username and password, and we issue this manage certificate -m command to do just that. So now let's open the config file of MID server 3 and verify that the password has been removed. And now the MID server is using mutual authentication. So to enable it, we need to restart the MID server, in which case it will restart it with a mutual authentication. Let's refresh the page and ensure that we have MID server 3 that is using mutual authentication with the correct username. This concludes the video about setting up MID server with mutual authentication. I hope you enjoyed it. Comments, questions, and suggestions are always welcome.